Well, joining me now in Vienna is former UN Assistant Secretary General Charles Petrie. He was a UN Development Programme representative for Myanmar, and he wrote the review of the UN's actions during Sri Lanka's civil war. In Yangon is Nyo Ohn Mint. He was Aung San Suu Kyi's spokesman and is a former member of Myanmar's ruling National League for Democracy. And joining us in Bangkok is Human Rights Watch's Deputy Director for Asia, Phil Robertson. Good to have you all on the program. Let me start with you, Phil. This UN report, scathing, looking at itself and its own actions, calling it a systemic failure. Was this necessary and accurate?
Well, it was certainly necessary. It should have gone much farther in terms of assigning accountability to individuals and agencies. In some ways, the report, while being very scathing about the system, was a bit of a parody of a UN reform report because ultimately no one is held accountable. Everybody blames the system. Everybody blames a dispute between development and human rights priorities. But at the end of the day, the people who made the mistakes in the field are essentially promoted. And that's what we've seen with the UN resident coordinator who was in charge of Myanmar at the time and now is the UN resident coordinator in India.
Yeah, so we're talking about Renata Lok-Desalegn, who was accused of downplaying concerns about worsening abuses against the Rohingya to further her development agenda. Built in implicitly into the report, and you have people commenting on it. Charles Petrie, when we look at this, has the UN failed because it was trying to balance two impossible things? On the one hand, some arms of the organization trying to hold Myanmar to account for human rights abuses, and we had these reports coming in of massacres and terrible things going on. And on the other hand, other arms of the UN trying to ensure that the country comes in from the cold and develops and becomes a proper player in the international system. Was it impossible to do both at the same time?
Well, the answer to the question is no, but I actually think the report was very good and very hard-hitting and needs to be taken in the context of the review that was done in Sri Lanka, the internal review, that highlighted exactly the same issues. So in a way, I think if you take Gert Rosenthal's report and juxtapose it to the Sri Lanka internal review report that was considered one of the most scathing on the UN, then I think you have a very dramatic conclusion that is to be drawn. I mean, in terms of balancing the development with the human rights, I mean, that's the false dilemma. And I would suggest that focusing on the RC's role is actually to misunderstand the fundamental failing of the UN, which is a systemic failing. And it's the fact that it's been unable to deal with both. There's no reason why the UN can't push a development agenda. There's no reason the UN can't also advocate a human rights agenda. And there's absolutely no reason why the UN can't implement a humanitarian response. When it's done at the level of the field, it becomes impossible because they're mutually exclusive approaches. But when it's done at a very senior level in New York, it is possible. And then it becomes a question of calibration. And that's where the UN failed. The UN failed in Sri Lanka. The UN failed in Myanmar by not having the courage to have a senior UN official responsible for implementing a coherent strategy.
Nyo Ohn Mint, fundamentally, it seems, according to the UN, that your government got away with genocide and ethnic cleansing because the UN was asleep at the wheel.
I don't really agree with that because, the UN has a very limited, capability to convince the both parties, like kind of, the Rohingya community as well as the Myanmar government. But of course, when you compare with that in the last 5 years or 6 years in Myanmar, that the previous government, and then the government has been very, very closely working with the UN, and then did more than that when the Cyclone Nuggets at the time, UN played a very big role, and UN, it should be credited to open the country to back
Certainly.
to the.
But Nyo, the
national.
UN is saying, based on its own review, when they had Guatemalan former Foreign Minister Gerrit Rosenthal head this commission and they did this review, they're saying they were too nice to Myanmar's government because it didn't deserve the niceness because of what it was doing in Rakhine State at the time.
No, that's a lot of, the exaggeration. So because you cannot find that the very solid, okay, when you have a solid incident in like an Indian village and they have been prosecuted, the wrongdoers. So then the UN, it's doing the best. But, the problem is that the only a one-sided and then look like a witch hunt towards the government and military. So
are you disappointed then that the UN is coming out and saying that we weren't hard enough on Myanmar's government and we weren't taking the threat serious enough because you believe that they were biased anyway?
So they just not biased, but that that's a capacity that what they could do it and what they should have done it, and then there's going to be a more independent the investigation, inquiries, and the conclusion is not yet. That was the very beginning of that, the investigation, very beginning of the collaboration between the different parties.
Okay. Phil Robertson, it's interesting because part of the criticism of Renata Lok-Desalegn was that there was a de-dramatizing of events. Would you agree that we're hearing a de-dramatizing of events from Nyo Ohn Mint and a different version perhaps of what had happened over the years?
What we're hearing is actually a cover-up. We're hearing a cover-up of crimes against humanity. We're hearing a cover-up of ethnic cleansing. We're hearing a cover-up of possible genocide. He's hewing to the common narrative that we're hearing from the Burmese government that, what are you talking about? Nothing went wrong. The reality is that there have been horrific atrocities in Rakhine State. Right now, we're seeing a blackout of the internet as the Burmese military now goes after the Arakan army, and Rakhine civilians will also be in the way of that. And the Burmese government is again saying, geez, we don't know what's going on, and the military is denying any accountability. The reality is that Burma is refusing to take any accountability for these atrocities that have been documented by the fact-finding mission and many others in excruciating detail. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, the international community needs to act. We need to see a global arms embargo against the Burmese military, and we need to be seeing sanctions against top government and military leaders in Myanmar until we see accountability. We're seeing these local International Commission of Inquiry headed by a former Philippines diplomat, which is going to be another cover-up. It seems that Myanmar has learned one thing from Sri Lanka, which is that if you keep creating sort of national commissions of investigation that really do nothing, it keeps the attention of the international community distracted enough to try to get away with these horrific crimes.
Let's get a response from Nyo Ohn Mint.
Well, it's a different perspective. What do you look at it and how you look at it? When you wanted to have it like someone wanted to, put on that like a trial, you just wanted to create the case. So you already accuse that, you already decide that he was guilty. So you have a suspicious the matter, then you have a the creating of that, who is going to, because I'm really shocked that, and I'm very stunned that the author killed so many more than 100 Hindus, but the human rights the activists.
Although Human Rights Watch has reported on that. In addition to that, I don't want to do Phil's job for him here, but they have reported on ARSA's atrocities and the atrocities that are linked to Myanmar's forces and the Buddhist forces, which seem to be far larger than ARSA's atrocities. Nevertheless, I want to bring Charles in here. Charles, we have Antonio Guterres saying, okay, we messed up. I'm taking this report very seriously. This is a serious problem. What happens next? Does the UN what does it do in the short term to change its approach to what is still an ongoing problem?
Well, I don't think that's what the report was addressing. And so in a way, I think right now we're talking about two different, of course, mutually supported dynamics. The report was looking at the ability of the UN to manage the crisis. And what came out is that the UN has once again failed to manage such a political crisis. And so I think what the Secretary General needs to do in looking at the report is to draw the conclusions of how better to structure the organization, the whole organization, to deal with the future crisis of this magnitude and gravity. Then there's the other issue of what to do with the situation in Myanmar. And that is, again, I think that's outside of the remit of the report. Mm-hmm. The report was very much looking at the UN's ability to manage a political crisis of this magnitude, and demonstrated that the UN failed the same way it failed in Sri Lanka.
But if we break this down, Charles, right? If we break this down and we say that what defines it as a crisis is that hundreds of thousands of people were on the move crossing over into a neighboring country, Bangladesh. What also defines it as a crisis is that thousands of people were killed and hundreds of homes, possibly thousands of homes, were burned to the ground. Yeah. If the UN is saying we failed to prevent this crisis or manage this crisis, it's also saying at the same time, and I don't want to put words into the report's mouth, but isn't it also saying we failed to prevent it and we failed to put it out while it was happening? Am I right?
Yeah, during the period of the report, yeah, it's exactly that, yeah. But it's not saying anything about what needs to be done now.
I see.
I mean, see, my point is that the Sri Lanka was a major failing of the organization, a systemic failing. Very clear lessons were spelt out following Sri Lanka, and the Secretary General of the time committed to implementing them. Right. A little bit later, or a little while later, we have the Myanmar Rohingya crisis, and one sees that none of the lessons were learned. That there were, but the big difference between Sri Lanka and Myanmar is that in Sri Lanka the UN was central to the response. Mm-hmm. There was no other organization that had. In Myanmar, the UN was not central to the response. It was one of the players, but not the key player.
Okay.
And for me, the drama and the tragedy for the UN, if it doesn't seriously take both these reports in account and implements the recommendations, is that the UN is increasingly become marginal and irrelevant in such contexts.
Understood.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I want to ask Phil Robertson about the internet blackout in Rakhine State. I want to circle back to that point that you made, because yes, it's not related to the Rohingya. You have an insurgency with the AA insurgents, or the Arakan army, not to be confused with ARSA. This is a Buddhist nationalist army. So you have a situation there, and they've cut the internet. Now we've got the UN Special Rapporteur coming out and criticizing the blackout, saying this is a clearance operation, or is providing cover for a clearance operation, and it could be or can be a cover for committing gross human rights violations against the civilian population. And I wonder, Phil, after this report has come out, are we seeing the UN maybe up the ante a little bit in its condemnation as a result of this report that came out, or am I maybe reading too much into it?
Well, I mean, I think we have seen an increasingly hard line from the acting UN resident coordinator, Nyo Ohn Mint, saying that, they were not going to comply with Myanmar's idea that they could just say that these internal displaced persons camps in central Rakhine State housing the Rohingya would be there permanently, and that the international community would just provide there indefinitely. They said that this is looking like a situation of apartheid, and we're not going to support that. But the problem is that no one has been held accountable within the Myanmar security forces for the violence that has taken place against the Rohingya in 2012, in 2016, in 2017. And unfortunately, no one's being held accountable for the violence that's now being perpetrated against the Buddhist Rakhine civilians who are caught in this violence as the Tatmadaw tries to chase down the Arakan army. It's important to recognize that this is a systematically rights-abusing army. The way they operate is targeting civilians. And if you talk to the Kachin people in the north, or the Karen people in the east, or the Mon people in the southeast, they will tell you the same thing, that they have had the same experience with this army. And unfortunately, the civilian government and its spokespeople are covering up for the violence and the abuses and the rights violations that are being perpetrated by the Burmese army against their own people. And that is unacceptable and has to change. And the UN, with its Human Rights Upfront project, which was one of the key issues that came out of the very important report that Charles wrote about the debacle in Sri Lanka, you know, the Human Rights Upfront approach in Myanmar failed. And now they have to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, how are we going to make this work in a real way in a troubled country like Myanmar or other troubled countries in other parts of the world?
Phil Robertson, Nyo Ohn Mint, and Charles Petrie, good to have you on the program. I've got to wrap, but I thank you again.